I'm Nathan Skipper with Montgomery Technology Incorporated, and this is session 6 of the MTI Control System Technician Training course. And we are continuing our look at the termination division of our control system layout. We're looking at the control hardware termination boards, and in this session we'll be looking at the 81222 input-only board. The input-only board provides a number of features that are common to the MTI control system, as well as some additional features that it only provides for particularly card reader inputs and input-only scenarios. So the first thing that you'll note when you look at the board is that you have the data loop port, just like every other termination board on the MTI system. Data loop port maps the same way, functions the same way as other boards. You have a tester port, which allows you to connect an MTI data loop tester to diagnose certain issues. You have an I/O card slot, which can either take the decoder board, the 81651, or the 81611, which is the WeGAN card reader board. You have the standard address switching provided through the dip switch, which allows you to set the address range for this card. You have a set of 8 connectors, of which you can connect 16 dry contact inputs, 2 per connector, which we'll explain in the next slide, or you can connect 8 WeGAN card reader inputs, depending on the card that you have attached on the I/O card slot. You also have a jumper, which allows you to select between sources of power for card readers. By default, the board will power the card readers that are connected via the data loop power, but if you have a long run or need additional power to power a complicated card reader of some sort, then you can connect that and change the jumper setting to use external power. And then lastly, you have the reader power supply port, which allows you to connect additional power for card readers. The 81222 has some common connectors that you'll be familiar with if you refer back to the video on the 81622. It's very similar, but there are some differences, particularly with respect to the fact that the 81222 allows you to connect card readers, and there's specific ways of connecting that itself. But a couple of things that will be familiar to you are, first of all, the data loop connection is identical to all other termination boards on an MTI system. You have the plus 12 volts DC line, the common line, the data 1 or D1 line, which is typically white, the D2 line, which is typically brown, and the clock, which is typically green. And you'll notice on the left-hand side of figure 0602, there's the same connector, and that connector is for the purpose of daisy chaining, as with other termination boards. If you're going to connect a dry contact input or DPS input for this board, you'll need to make sure that you're using the 81651 decoder board in the I/O card slot on the board. That will provide the functionality for receiving those inputs. And a DPS or a dry contact input connects in the following way. One thing to note about these connectors is you'll notice that there are 8 connectors on the board, but the board will handle 16 inputs, and the way that is possible is because each connector can take 2 inputs. And so starting at position 0, you would have N0 common on the second position of that connector, and then you would have N0 positive connection, N1 positive connection, and N1 common connection. As mentioned earlier, you have a jumper which allows you to select between power sources for the card reader. The card reader can be sourced by the power for the data loop, which is the default position of the jumper, but it can also be sourced by an external power supply. And to select the external power supply as the power source for the card readers, you need to move the jumper to the non-default position as shown on this arrow here. The connector for the power allows you to to daisy chain the power from one 81222 down to another, and so you can you can connect the 12 volts DC in and out, and then the common in and out. And the last connection I want to show you is the card reader hookup. One thing to note about this is if you're looking at this picture for figure 0602, you'll notice a top and a bottom set of connections, and on the top connection you'll notice that the wire map for the card reader is reversed from the bottom connector. I'm going to be referring to the bottom connector, which will move from left to right as I illustrate each of these connections. So for a card reader, you have first the plus 12 DC connection, then the common connection, the data 0 connection for the card reader, the data 1 connection for the card reader, and then lastly you skip a position over to the LED output for the card reader. For all MTI termination boards, the board addressing is the same, using the dip switches and the table that I've provided here, and we discussed earlier with the 81622 board. You can address the board according to what addresses it represents.